March 5, 1943, 0330 hours. Willow Run Assembly Plant, Ypsilanti, Michigan. The air, thick with the smell of hot metal and lubricating oil, hums with a power that has nothing to do with the war raging thousands of miles away. It is the sound of a nation forging thunderbolts. For 19-year-old Jean Phillips, this sound is the rhythm of her new life. 3 months ago, she was on her family's farm in Ohio, her world defined by seasons and sunlight. Now her world is a single colossal room, a mile long and a quarter-mile wide, where night and day have been erased by the relentless glare of thousands of fluorescent bulbs. Her hands, calloused from farm work, are now deft and sure as she guides a pneumatic rivet gun. The staccato thump-thump-thump echoes the anxious beat of her own heart. She drives another rivet into the gleaming aluminum skin of a B-24 Liberator's wing section. It is the 800th rivet of her shift, with thousands more to go before the morning whistle. Tucked into the pocket of her overalls is a worn folded letter from her fiancé, Sergeant Frank Miller, somewhere in North Africa. His last letter spoke of endless sand, strange stars, and the menacing drone of Stukas. He'd asked if she could hear the planes being built. If she knew they were coming, she knows. Every rivet is a prayer. Every completed wing section is a shield for him. Out on the vast floor, a completed bomber, number 1957, is slowly towed toward the massive hangar doors, its unpainted skin reflecting the endless lights. It looks alien, powerful, a metallic predator born far from any battlefield. A new fuselage immediately takes its place on the assembly line. The line never stops. It is a river of steel, and Jean is just one of thousands of souls channeling its current. Outside, a Michigan winter grips the world in ice, but inside Willow Run, it is eternally, ferociously summer. A summer of creation. A summer of war. Jean doesn't know it, but the bomber she is working on will be part of the 44th Bombardment Group, destined for the flak-filled skies over German industrial targets. She is building the very weapon that will be sent to destroy factories not so different from her own, in a war of production that has become as critical as any battle. The staggering efficiency of this place, the sheer scale of it, feels like a guarantee of victory. But the cost of that victory, measured in rivets and in lives, is a calculus no one yet dares to compute. Before the first shots were fired at Pearl Harbor, the United States was a nation climbing out of the Great Depression, its military a shadow of its future self. The U.S. Army in 1939 was smaller than that of Portugal. Its industrial base, while vast, was configured for peace, for crafting automobiles, refrigerators, and radios. The Axis powers, particularly Germany, had spent the better part of a decade honing their economies for war. German industry, under the 4-year plan directed by Hermann Göring, was a finely tuned machine of armament production. Japan, fueled by imperial ambition, had dedicated its limited resources to building a world-class navy and air force. They believed the consumer-driven, isolationist United States lacked the will and the centralized authority to convert its commercial power into military might before it was too late. This was their fundamental miscalculation. The American strategic plan, once war was declared, was not merely to match Axis production, but to overwhelm it on a scale the world had never witnessed. This was the arsenal of democracy concept, first articulated by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in a 1940 fireside chat. The strategy was brutally simple: leverage America's unparalleled raw materials, industrial capacity, and technological innovation to bury the enemy under a literal mountain of steel. The plan rested on 3 pillars. First, mass mobilization of industry. The government established the War Production Board, WPB, in January 1942, an agency with sweeping powers to direct private enterprise. It could halt the production of civilian goods, allocate scarce materials like rubber, copper, and aluminum, and force companies to retool for war. General Motors, the world's largest corporation, was ordered to stop making cars and start making M4 Sherman tanks, Grumman F4F Wildcat fighters, and Allison aircraft engines. Ford's revolutionary moving assembly line was adapted at the Willow Run plant to produce a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Chrysler, a master of engineering, was tasked with producing the engines for B-29 Super Fortresses and the hulls of Sherman tanks. Second, mobilization of labor. With over 16 million Americans serving in the armed forces, a vast labor gap appeared. This was filled by demographics previously marginalized in heavy industry. Over 6 million women entered the workforce, personified by the Rosie the Riveter propaganda campaign. They became welders, mechanics, and assembly line workers, proving they could perform these man's jobs with precision and dedication. African Americans, migrating from the rural South in the Second Great Migration, filled hundreds of thousands of factory jobs, though they still faced segregation and discrimination. Third, logistical supremacy. It wasn't enough to build the tanks and planes. They had to be delivered to fronts in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. Here, the American maritime industry performed one of the war's greatest miracles. Industrialist Henry J. Kaiser applied mass production techniques to shipbuilding. His shipyards abandoned traditional methods for prefabrication and modular construction. Instead of building a ship keel up in a dry dock, massive sections were built simultaneously across the shipyard and then welded together. The result was the Liberty ship, a simple 2,700-ton cargo vessel. Initially taking 230 days to build, Kaiser's yards eventually reduced that time to an average of 42 days. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was famously built in just 4 days and 15 hours. By 1943, 3 of these ships were being launched every single day. This bridge of ships ensured that American and Allied forces would never lack for beans, bullets, or bombers. The Axis, particularly Germany with its U-boat campaign, staked its strategy on sinking this tonnage faster than America could build it. They would lose that bet, catastrophically. For millions of young Americans, the war began not in a trench, but on a factory floor. Consider a young man named David Jensen, a 20-year-old from Kenosha, Wisconsin. In 1941, he was working at the Simmons Bedding Company. By 1943, he was standing in the cavernous final assembly building of the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, a government-owned facility operated by Chrysler. The sheer noise was the first shock, a deafening symphony of clanging steel, whirring machinery, and the roar of tested engines. The scale was inhuman. Row after row of olive-drab M4 Sherman tank hulls sat in various states of completion, stretching into a hazy, metallic infinity. His job was to install the wiring harnesses for the turret's electrical traverse system. It was intricate, demanding work. One crossed wire could mean a gunner couldn't bring a 75mm main gun to bear in the heat of battle. The foremen, many of them tough old hands from the auto industry, were relentless. There were no excuses. The quotas were absolute. The sign hanging over the main floor read, "The boys on the front line are depending on you." Every tank that rolled off the line was a tangible promise to those boys. David worked 10-hour shifts 6 days a week. His hands were perpetually stained with grease and pricked by wires. Sleep was a luxury, but there was a profound sense of purpose. He wasn't just connecting wires. He was giving a tank crew its fangs. He would see newsreels at the local cinema showing Shermans rolling through Italian villages or Pacific islands, and wonder if one of them was his. The work was depersonalizing. He was a number, a cog in a vast and complex machine. Yet it was also deeply personal. His older brother was with the 1st Marine Division on an island called Guadalcanal. Every tank, every shell, every rivet was a piece of America being sent to help him survive. The fear was a constant low-grade hum beneath the factory's roar. The fear that he wasn't working fast enough, that a mistake he made could cost a life, that his brother's next letter might not arrive. This was a different kind of front line, one fought with slide rules and wrenches instead of rifles, but the stakes felt just as high. The anticipation was not for battle, but for the end of the shift, the weekly production numbers, and ultimately, the news of victory that they were all working to build. From the glittering halls of Berlin and the disciplined corridors of Tokyo, the view of American industry was clouded by ideological arrogance and strategic misjudgment. Axis leadership, particularly the Nazi hierarchy, held a deep-seated contempt for the United States. In their view, America was a culturally degenerate, racially mixed, and politically divided nation, softened by consumerism and incapable of the Spartan discipline required for total war. Adolf Hitler himself repeatedly dismissed America's industrial potential, famously scoffing at its production of refrigerators and razor blades. German intelligence, while aware of America's raw industrial capacity, fundamentally misunderstood its adaptability. Their own system, under planners like Fritz Todt and later Albert Speer, was geared towards armament in depth. It focused on producing technologically superior, high-quality weapons like the Tiger tank or the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. This approach prioritized quality over quantity and resulted in complex designs that were difficult to mass-produce and maintain. They expected the Americans to follow a similar, slower path of careful, methodical retooling. They could not conceive of a system that would sacrifice tailored perfection for overwhelming, good enough numbers. The idea of a car company like Ford building a bomber every hour seemed not just improbable, but absurd, a fantasy of American propaganda. German military strategists, like Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, believed they had the solution. They calculated that if their submarines could sink more than 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, the logistical bridge across the Atlantic would collapse, England would be starved into submission, and the buildup of American forces for an invasion of Europe would become impossible. In early 1942, they came terrifyingly close to achieving this goal during the second happy time off the American East Coast. They believed that American shipbuilding, impressive as it might be, could never outpace the rate of destruction. In the Pacific, the Japanese leadership operated under a similar delusion, though one born of different circumstances. Their strategy for the attack on Pearl Harbor was predicated on a short, decisive war. They intended to deliver a knockout blow, seize a vast defensive perimeter of resource-rich territories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, and then negotiate a peace with a demoralized America. They were acutely aware of their own industrial limitations compared to the U.S. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, famously warned, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." The Japanese High Command largely ignored his prescient warning. They believed American fighting spirit was brittle, and that the public would have no stomach for a long, bloody war across a vast ocean. They saw American industry as a distant threat, one that would take years to mobilize effectively, years they believed they did not have to give. They expected a limited war of attrition, not an industrial tidal wave that would sweep them from the seas and burn their cities to the ground. The years 1943 and 1944 represent the roaring crescendo of American industrial output, a relentless cascade of material that fundamentally changed the operational realities of the war. This was not a single battle, but a global offensive waged on assembly lines. Consider the air war over Europe. In 1942, the U.S. 8th Air Force struggled to put 100 bombers over a target. By mid-1944, they were launching 1,000 plane raids as a matter of routine. A single mission by the 8th Air Force could now drop a greater tonnage of bombs than the entire German Luftwaffe could in a month. This was a direct result of factories like Willow Run and Boeing's Seattle plant. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator poured out of these facilities. In 1942, the U.S. produced 47 800 aircraft. In 1943, that number jumped to 85 900. In 1944, it peaked at a staggering 96,300 planes. A German fighter pilot shooting down a B-17 knew with sickening certainty that 2 more had just rolled off an assembly line to take its place. On the Eastern Front, the American contribution was felt through the Lend-Lease Act. While the Soviet Union's own T-34 tank production was a formidable achievement, American industry provided the critical support that kept the Red Army mobile. The U.S. sent over 400,000 trucks, mostly Studebakers and Jeeps, to the Soviets. This motorization gave the Red Army a strategic mobility it had never possessed, allowing for the deep encirclement operations like Operation Bagration in 1944 that shattered the German Army Group Center. They also sent 14,000 aircraft, 7,000 tanks, and millions of tons of food, fuel, and raw materials. A German soldier fighting in the snows of Russia might be killed by a Soviet soldier who had been fed with American Spam, driven to the front in an American truck, and was communicating via an American-made radio. In the Pacific, the action sequence was defined by naval power. After the devastating losses at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy embarked on the largest shipbuilding program in history. The Essex-class aircraft carrier became the backbone of the Pacific Fleet. These were floating cities of war, capable of carrying nearly 100 aircraft. 17 of them were commissioned during the war. In 1943 alone, American shipyards delivered 147 aircraft carriers of all types, fleet, light, and escort. Japan, in the entire war, built 17. The naval battles of 1944, like the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, were not contests of equals. They were industrial mismatches. The U.S. Navy could absorb losses that would have been crippling to the Imperial Japanese Navy and continue its offensive unabated. Grumman's F-6F Hellcat fighter, designed specifically to beat the Japanese Zero, was produced in such numbers, over 12,000 in total, that American pilots could overwhelm their more experienced but perpetually outnumbered Japanese counterparts. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944 where U.S. pilots shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft with minimal losses, was a victory won as much in the Grumman factory in Bethpage, New York, as it was in the skies over Saipan. The flow of material was unstoppable, a weapon in its own right. The sheer volume of American production created an entirely new and unexpected military doctrine: warfare by overwhelming logistics. It wasn't just about having more tanks, but about having so many tanks that tactical and even operational losses became statistically acceptable. This was the unforeseen outcome that shattered Axis strategic planning. The prime example is the M4 Sherman tank. Critically, the Sherman was often outmatched on a one-to-one basis by heavier German tanks like the Panther and the Tiger. Its 75mm gun, later 76mm, struggled to penetrate their thick frontal armor, while their powerful 75mm and 88mm cannons could destroy a Sherman from long range. German tank doctrine emphasized this technological superiority and the skill of their veteran crews. They expected tank battles to be duels of quality, but America didn't play by those rules. For every one Tiger tank the Germans painstakingly built, the U.S. produced nearly 40 Shermans. American armored divisions swarmed the battlefield. An American platoon of 5 Shermans might lose 3 or 4 tanks destroying a single Panther, but the 5th would get the kill, and an entire platoon of replacements would be available the next day. This brute force approach horrified German commanders, who saw it as crude and wasteful, but it was brutally effective. The U.S. could afford the losses, Germany could not. Furthermore, the Sherman's mechanical reliability, a legacy of its automotive industry design, meant more tanks were available for combat at any given time, while the complex German machines were often sidelined by mechanical failures. Another surprise was the multiplier effect of seemingly mundane production. The ubiquitous 2.5-ton deuce-and-a-half truck and the Jeep were arguably as important as the Sherman tank. The mobility they afforded the U.S. Army was unprecedented. After the breakout from Normandy and Operation Cobra, General George S. Patton's Third Army was able to execute its legendary race across France, primarily because it was almost entirely motorized. The Red Ball Express, a massive non-stop truck convoy system, supplied his armored columns as they advanced, a logistical feat the German army, still heavily reliant on horse-drawn transport, could only dream of. Perhaps the most shocking outcome for the Axis was the speed of America's recovery and counterattack in the Pacific. The Japanese High Command had calculated that it would take the U.S. Navy years to rebuild after Pearl Harbor. They were wrong. Through a combination of rapid repairs to damaged ships, the USS California, sunk at Pearl Harbor, was refloated, modernized, and fought in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and the astonishing output of new vessels. The U.S. seized naval supremacy by mid-1943, far ahead of the most pessimistic Japanese timetables. The enemy did not expect a war of attrition. They certainly did not expect to be on the losing side of it so quickly. The industrial power of the U.S. didn't just supplement military strategy, it became the strategy. The plan was no longer just to outfight the enemy, but to literally bury them in production. The psychological impact of America's industrial might on the Axis fighting man was profound and corrosive, transforming initial confidence into a gnawing, soul-crushing despair. For a German soldier on the front lines in 1944, the experience was one of being erased by an invisible, inexhaustible enemy. A machine gun nest, carefully concealed, would be obliterated not by a squad of infantry, but by a terrifying barrage from a dozen M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers. The sheer volume of American artillery fire, known as a Feuerwalze or fire waltz, was unlike anything they had ever faced, including on the Eastern Front. It was impersonal, industrial-scale destruction. An entire grid square on a map could be systematically pounded into dust before a single American GI set foot in it. German veterans, who had prided themselves on their battlefield prowess and tactical skill, found that their experience meant little when faced with an enemy who substituted firepower for finesse. The sky became a source of constant terror. For a Luftwaffe pilot, the sight of a 1,000-plane bomber stream blotting out the sun, escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustangs, was a vision of the apocalypse. They would fly through a wall of defensive fire from the bombers' 50-caliber machine guns, knowing that even if they shot one down, it was a meaningless victory. This led to a sense of futility that decimated morale. On the ground, the constant presence of Allied fighter bombers, the P-47 Thunderbolt, or jobos as the Germans called them, meant that any movement during the day, a single truck or a column of men, could bring instant death from above. This air supremacy confined German units to night movement, paralyzing their operational mobility and breeding a deep sense of helplessness. For the Japanese soldier, the psychological shock was perhaps even greater. Raised in a warrior culture that emphasized spiritual strength, sation, over material advantage, they were suddenly confronted by an enemy for whom material was everything. A Japanese soldier on an island garrison would watch the horizon fill with an American fleet larger than any he had ever imagined. Hundreds of ships, dozens of carriers. They would endure days of pre-invasion naval bombardment that literally reshaped the island's geography, turning fortified caves and bunkers into tombs. When the American Marines and soldiers landed, they brought with them a staggering array of weaponry. Flamethrower tanks that could incinerate bunkers, armored bulldozers that buried defenders alive, and endless supplies of grenades, ammunition, and rations. The Japanese soldier, often left to starve and fight to the death with dwindling supplies, saw an enemy that seemed to have an infinite capacity to replace men and machines. This contrast between their own material poverty and the enemy's unimaginable wealth shattered the myth of spiritual superiority. It was replaced by a grim, fatalistic acceptance of death. Their fight was no longer for victory, but for a proper death in service to the emperor. The American industrial machine had become a psychological weapon, inducing a sense of awe, terror, and ultimately, hopelessness in its foes. By VE Day in May 1945, the United States had produced approximately 300,000 military aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 2.6 million machine guns. It had launched over 5,000 cargo ships and 2,200 warships. At its peak in 1944, American industry was producing more war material than all of its enemies, Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. The arsenal of democracy had not just contributed to victory, it had defined its very nature. The human cost was immense. The war effort demanded sacrifice from every corner of American society, but the strategic impact was undeniable. The Axis powers were not just defeated on the battlefield, they were crushed by the sheer weight of American production. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, admitted as much during post-war interrogations. He acknowledged that Germany's focus on wonder weapons and technological marvels was a strategic dead end against an enemy that could simply overwhelm them with mass-produced, reliable, and ever-present equipment. The broader impact of this industrial mobilization reshaped the post-war world. The United States emerged from the war not weakened, but as the world's undisputed economic and military superpower. Its industrial base was untouched by the devastation that had leveled Europe and Japan. The wartime technological innovations, in aviation, electronics, nuclear energy, and medicine, like penicillin production, would drive the post-war economic boom. The social changes were equally profound. The millions of women and African Americans who had entered the industrial workforce had challenged traditional social norms, planting the seeds for the civil rights and feminist movements of the coming decades. The arsenal of democracy was more than just a wartime slogan. It was the practical application of a nation's entire economic and social strength toward a single, existential goal. It demonstrated that modern warfare was a contest of systems, of production, logistics, and organization, as much as it was a contest of armies. The men and women on the home front, like Gene Phillips riveting a bomber wing in the endless light of the Willow Run plant, never fired a shot. Yet, their collective effort forged the weapons that secured the Allied victory, proving that in the crucible of the Second World War, the factory floor was a battlefield as decisive as any in history. The hum of the assembly line had become the sound of freedom, a sound that ultimately drowned out the jackboots of tyranny and the roar of empires.